Hi, everyone. My name is Betsy Morace. I'm from the Columbia Journalism Review. Thank you for being here. Several months ago, I was in the CJR office with Lauren Watson and Meghnad Bose, who were fellows at the time. And Lauren mentioned to me a project that she had worked on in class with Azmat Khan. And that led to a series of conversations between the Columbia Journalism Review and the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism, where Azmat serves as director, about what's happening to journalism in Gaza. The first project to come out of that dialogue is what brings us here today. And we wanted to collect thoughts, including some maybe unconventional ideas, to defend press freedom in Gaza. Gaza is the deadliest place in the world to be a member of the media. Since the start of the war, some 200 media workers have been killed. Israel and Egypt have not allowed foreign reporters to enter Gaza, apart from embedded trips with the military, which means that major press outlets are severely limited in terms of what they can cover and how. And as Meghnad Bose has written for CJR, on top of that, journalists on the ground are starving without access to clean water. One person told him, "Hunger scrambles everything, thought, memory, even language." And as 972, an Israeli magazine, has reported, a unit of Israel's military has been tasked explicitly with linking journalists to Hamas. Lauren, Meghnad, and Azmat reached out to dozens of journalists, legal scholars, and other creative thinkers who suggested taking alternate routes into the region, airing disclaimers about the lack of access, coordinated campaigns, and bringing war crimes charges. On the last of these, Joel Simon has elaborated for CJR in a piece on Article 79 of the Additional Protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which affirms the protections afforded to journalists covering armed conflict and how that could be used to make a legal case against Israel for killing Nasser al-Sharif, a 28-year-old correspondent for Al Jazeera who had been one of the best-known journalists in Gaza. You can read more about threats to journalists in Gaza and around the world, including in the United States, at cjr.org and by subscribing to our newsletter. And it's our hope that you'll continue to read our work as we strive not only to chronicle what's going on, but also how the media is responding. I've been incredibly impressed by Azmat's ability to think clearly about many of the most difficult challenges facing the press. She's an extraordinary journalist, and we're very lucky to be hearing from her and all the other panelists who have joined us together today. Sharif, sorry, this is not my phone. Okay. Sharif Abdel Quddus, the Middle East editor of Drop Site News, Layla Al-Arian, the executive producer of Fault Lines, Jody Ginsberg, the CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists, Kenneth Roth, former executive director of Human Rights Watch, and Trevor Tim, executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, are all here with us, and thank you for being here with us too. And Azmat, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Betsy. I have been so impressed by Columbia Journalism Review under Betsy's leadership. She is a clear-eyed editor. She's incredibly gifted and talented, and she has values I deeply care about. I'd also like to just say she is the only editor in about a decade who has kept me to the original deadline that we'd set. And for that reason, I am truly in awe. So thank you so much, Betsy. I'm grateful to you, to the CJR Fellows, Lauren Watson and Meghnad Bose, and for everyone who's here in the room tonight and the panelists, because we all share core values. Your being here means that you are someone who believes that journalism is a calling and that bearing witness is one of the most profoundly important acts, and we must do everything we can to protect freedom of the press. The threats to press freedom are urgent in Gaza. They are urgent for every single journalist who is still managing somehow, beyond belief, to work on the ground, to risk their lives. They also have long-term consequences for distrust in our media institutions and for precedents that could jeopardize the safety of journalists anywhere, in any conflict in the future. Among both news consumers and members of the profession, many have noted what they see as the muted response of journalistic entities and of governments, which have not been inclined towards direct action or collective appeals, and instead often focus coverage, for instance, on poorly evidenced accusations that someone Israel killed was a combatant, rather than well-documented evidence of that person's work as a reporter. A growing number have come to view this ultimately as a failure to contend with the man-made catastrophe in Gaza, including for reporters, and it has marked a breaking point in their relationships with legacy news institutions. This has dire consequences for all of us, and most urgently for journalists on the ground. Amid all of these threats, we've seen a number of outlets and some press freedom groups largely turn to tools that are often used in their advocacy arsenal: letters, condemnations, an occasional court case. But as many of those who are here have argued, there needs to be more. So tonight, the focus of our discussion, while it will touch upon many of these threats, I think every single person here, myself included, for the last 2 years, has been on or attended multiple panels, countless panels, looking at the threats to press freedom in Gaza. And that's not what tonight is about. It is not just understanding the unprecedented nature of these threats. It's actually to talk about what we can and should be doing in response, what has and hasn't worked and why, or I guess what hasn't worked and why, and what other ideas there are out there. So if you've yet to read the Columbia Journalism Review story that we published in August, I'd certainly encourage you to do so, but it's not necessary to have done for tonight. We're going to delve into these ideas and topics, and I hope you also, during the time for Q&A, will bring up ideas, questions, alternative viewpoints. This is really about pushing this forward and having a real discussion. So Jody, I wanted to start with you because you were at the helm of the Committee to Protect Journalists, which has been fierce in documenting these threats. In fact, as I understand it, the organization has had to really change its resources, the way it works, because of the scale of threats to journalists in Gaza and what is happening. Can you lay out a little bit for the audience what we're seeing, how it ranks or compares to other conflicts that CPJ has covered, and how you would distill the sort of response that you've been seeing within our community?
Sure, and thank you so much for having this event. It's so important. To be clear about one thing, we haven't changed the way we work in the sense that we haven't changed our methodology. Our methodology is the same, and that's something that we get accused of all the time, that somehow we've changed our methodology, especially for Gaza. We haven't, and that's really important because it allows us to make these comparisons that you're talking about. So I want to be very clear about that. We have had to scale up because we've never dealt with anything like what we're dealing with in Gaza because the numbers are so enormous, horrific, constant, that we have to add people to be able to do the documentation. But we knew from the outset that documentation was key because that was going to be the evidence base for the advocacy. You have to understand what's actually happening because we're also in a war of information, which we will come back to. Since the start of the war, more than 200 Palestinian journalists have been killed by Israel. That is more combined than the previous 3 years globally put together. To give you some sense of the context, this is the deadliest conflict for journalists and media workers that CPJ has ever documented, and we've been doing the documentation work for more than 30 years. There is no comparison. And when we're looking at the documentation, what we're trying to establish is, was someone a journalist or a media worker, and to try and understand how they were killed and whether they were targeted deliberately for their work. That's a distinction that can feel, I think, sometimes confusing to people because what we're trying to establish often is, did a government or did an entity that murdered the individual, could they reasonably be expected to have known that those individuals were journalists? And that's very difficult to prove in a genocide. It's because it's very difficult to say, well, was that building in which several hundred people were killed, was that attacked because that person was trying to kill a journalist or because they're just trying to eliminate that entire building? So that's why the numbers that we have for what we call murdered, which is our way of explaining someone was killed deliberately for our work, is much lower than that 200 number. It's somewhere around 26. But again, that's unprecedented. That number of deliberately targeted journalists is unprecedented. And as you mentioned, there are rules protecting civilians in war, and journalists are considered to be civilians, and so must never be targeted, and to do so is a war crime. So on all measures, this is without precedent, and it is also accompanied, however, by a great deal of skepticism about the numbers, the validity, are they really journalists, can we trust them? That is part of a deliberate strategy from Israel, something that the magazine 972 actually documented. It's a deliberate strategy to undermine our confidence in what Palestinian journalists are reporting because they can't be trusted, because they're being accused of being terrorists. And that's all part and parcel of a much broader strategy that has involved targeting media facilities, that has involved banning certain outlets like Al Jazeera, that has involved sanctioning other outlets like Haaretz in Israel. So it's all part of a much broader attempt to control the narrative about what is happening. And as you said in your introduction, unfortunately, far too many media outlets have been far too willing to believe that narrative rather than, as I memorably said in another interview, journalists and media organizations doing their effing jobs and actually finding out what the real story is.
Yes, thank you. And I want to just step out into this discreditization of Palestinian journalists. That can take many forms. It can take the form of branding journalists as Hamas, but it can also take the form of simply saying that they're staging their work, to accuse them of their images not being things that we can verify and vet. The scale of these attacks goes so far to even accuse some of them of having had pre-knowledge of the October 7th attacks simply because they went out to go and cover them, like simply because they were doing their jobs. That has materialized in so many ways, even so that even protecting or advocating for a journalist can make you a target as well. Leila, can you talk a little bit about the ways you've seen the discreditization of journalists, but also the erasure of their humanity and who they are as people and the work that they're doing?
Sure. As you mentioned, thank you so much for having this event. Although I would say that I wish it happened sooner. I appreciate all of your efforts. I very much appreciate the CJR special issue, which I think is incredibly important, and I urge you all to read it. But I can't help but think I wish all of these conversations and these efforts and the urgency around advocating for Palestinian journalists happened 2 years ago, happened when it first started. We see not just the killing of journalists in Gaza, but also the killing of their family members. So as early as October 25th, 2023, the family members of my Al Jazeera colleague Wa'il al-Dahdouh were killed in their home in Nusayrat refugee camp. His wife, 2 of his children, and his grandchild, who was, I think, 18 months old. Just 5 days later, there's an article in the New Yorker magazine essentially putting a further target on the backs of journalists in Gaza, accusing them of being Hamas propagandists simply for reporting what they see with their eyes and what they hear with their ears. So it's especially painful when this attempt to discredit the work of these journalists is happening by other journalists. I was completely appalled to read that article, again, 5 days after the killing of Wa'il's family. And you should very much read a Guardian article written by Nasreen Malik about Wa'il and his losses, because in January of 2024, his son Hamza Dahdouh was also killed, along with another Al Jazeera journalist. Wa'il himself was injured in a horrific attack that killed his cameraman. Sharif actually wrote an excellent, very detailed article Sharif Abdul Qudus here about the killing of Samir Abu Daqqa. Israel basically had him bleed to death for 5 hours, preventing any medical care, which is something that we also saw with the killing of Shireen Abu Aqla when medical care was also denied to her. Shireen was my Al Jazeera colleague who was killed in 2022. And after Shireen was killed, her family warned again and again, every chance they got, and Shireen was a US citizen, that if there's no accountability when it comes to her killing, what hope do any other journalists have, any other Palestinian journalists, given her status as a US citizen? And I believe the lack of accountability from that case, and we can get into more details about that case, it's the most investigated, I would argue, case of the killing of any Palestinian in history. If there's no accountability from that case, what hope do we have for anyone else? And of course, that lack of accountability is what led us in this situation now when more than 200 Palestinian journalists have been killed. And we can get into all the different ways that their work and their legitimacy and their credibility has been called into question. But I can say, as someone who's worked directly with journalists in Gaza, they are incredibly professional, devoted to the profession in a way I've never seen any other group of journalists, literally putting their lives on the line to do this work. And they have simply documented this genocide. That's all they've done for the world to see in the hope that it would stop. And I just want to end this answer by saying, it's important to also acknowledge the moment we're in, which is that the slaughter continues, even here. As we speak here right now, it's continuing. And I actually reached out to one of the journalists that I work with, and I said, that I'm speaking here tonight, and for him to just see if he had anything to say. His name is Abdul Qadir Sabah. And he said, today is harder than yesterday, and tomorrow will be even harder. The situation is catastrophic. People are squeezed into 3 kilometer by 3 kilometer area, surrounded by the Israeli military. If they attack a location, they attack again. It's impossible to cover. Covering it has become extremely difficult and dangerous. And this is something you hear time and again from journalists right now on the ground, that it's more dangerous than ever before. He said just moving around is extremely dangerous. Just having things like shelter and internet spots has become impossible. And this is a systematic campaign of eliminating journalists in order to eliminate the eyewitnesses of the crimes that continue.
So let's just pause for a second. We have seen these unprecedented threats. We have seen this happening from the very beginning. It's like since October 7th, we have seen journalists killed. Issam Abdullah was killed in Lebanon on October, I believe it was 13th, 2023, while running a Reuters live feed. We've seen that happen last month. These things are repeating. They're happening over and over. Let's just walk through what have journalism organizations, when it comes to advocacy, when it comes to trying to protect journalists, what have been some of the main means of trying to raise awareness, but also stop this that you've seen happen?
So do you mean media organizations, or do you mean?
Media organizations and press freedom groups.
So there have been a number of different tactics. So the first, as I mentioned, that we felt very strongly was that we had to document to be able to say what was happening and to put that in context, and to use that to advocate for Israel to uphold its international commitments. So statements of condemnation, calling for investigations. We called repeatedly for an investigation into the killing of Issam Abdullah. And actually there have now been 4 at least independent investigations that all show that Israel would have known that they were journalists and targeted them anyway, in very much a similar way, as you say, to the Nasser Hospital attack last month. It was very difficult in the very beginning to even get many organizations to recognize that this was an issue. As I say, we had that kind of continual questioning, are they really journalists? Which was not the same as Ukraine, for example. So I did not get people ringing me up to say, are they really journalists about Ukraine or Afghanistan? But I did, and we did, about Gaza. And so I think that made quite a lot of organizations reticent about speaking out about what was happening. News organizations, I think, in the beginning, a lot of them were very much focused on how do they get people out, what can they do to get people out. We coordinated in the very early days tried to coordinate some collective statements, in particular calling for international access, because again, that's another unprecedented situation. No international independent media access since the start of the war. That's unheard of in any war in modern history. So they would sign on to those, and we know a lot of the data that we've been gathering and others have been gathering was used in some of the ICJ submissions and the ICC submissions. So there have been those submissions. RSF has submitted a number of cases to the International Criminal Court, and continued sort of behind the scenes advocacy with governments that it was believed were going to say anything. But most of those have been very reluctant. Some, including the Biden administration, did put out statements in the beginning sort of saying journalists should be protected, but we saw no actual concrete action to make that happen.
On that note, when we're talking about the kind of reluctance compared to other conflicts, compared to other wars, compared to other journalist killings among news organizations to even just cover this appropriately, to do the same level of documentation, or even to cover CPJ's documentation, it raises real questions about the ethos of journalism. And I think for many, like the excuse you'll often hear is that journalists aren't advocates, that, I've gotten this response when I've sort of asked or pressed certain news agencies when it comes to, why aren't you, or why didn't you sign on to this media blackout campaign? Why didn't you participate in having a blank front page on September 1st when all of these other news outlets did? And you'll often get an answer like, well, that's advocacy and we don't do that. And Trevor, I want to turn to you because you have studied the history of advocacy among news organizations, particularly when it comes to freedom of the press. And I'd love for you to give us a sort of historic look of what that looks like.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me at this important event. I think there's actually two things to look at here, which is advocacy of news organizations, but also the concept of objectivity. And we could spend a whole hour or a whole semester talking about how news organizations interpret objectivity. One simple thing news organizations could do within their current rubric without changing a thing is to just make it crystal clear in every single story that they write about the Gaza war, whether it is talking about journalists or not, that number one, there's been 200 journalists killed in this conflict, and number two, Israel refuses to allow international journalists in to get this, to verify any of their outlandish claims. And news organizations can do this within their stories via their standards editors, making sure that it gets in there. But also they could use technology to actually make this more interactive. So an easy thing that they could do is create an interactive widget, which is essentially placed high up next to a story that automatically updates with CPJ's numbers that tells readers, even if they're reading about the Gaza war and not a journalist killed, that this is a key aspect in this conflict. But to the advocacy question, that is also often a refrain from news organizations, that we don't engage in advocacy. And especially when this comes to press freedom, it's not actually true. News organizations have actually run some of the most effective advocacy campaigns that we've seen. I mean, so the most recent example would be the Wall Street Journal and the reporter who was imprisoned in Russia, Evan Gershkovich. The Wall Street Journal ran a sustained advocacy campaign on behalf of their reporter, not only making sure that they were constantly covering the case in the newspaper, but running social media campaigns. All of their journalists were wearing shirts or using hashtags, making sure to keep Evan's case alive in the public sphere. They were also pressuring the U.S. government behind the scenes to try to negotiate for Evan's release, and they were successful. Evan is now out of Russian prison, and and free. The same thing goes for Reuters. They had a journalists who were imprisoned in Myanmar a few years ago. They also ran a sustained journalism is not a crime campaign to make sure that this issue was at the forefront in the public mind and that people didn't forget about them. But those are just two very recent examples. Actually, I think that journalists and news organizations engaged in probably the most effective civil disobedience campaign that we have seen since the civil rights movement in the 1970s and the 1980s, when state governments were attempting to subpoena journalists to uncover their sources and force them to testify in court. And what news organizations, or what journalists did with their news organizations backing, is refuse to comply with these subpoenas, and in many times ended up in jail. And what would happen in these cases, because they were so loudly protesting that these stories would be on the front page of the news and people would see that journalists are going to jail for doing their job, states across the country started passing journalist shield laws that essentially protected journalists from testifying against their sources, at least in state court. We still have no federal law, unfortunately. And so, news organizations can and do engage in advocacy on occasion, and when they decide to do it, they are actually very good at it. And so, of course, the mass killing of journalists, or the largest killing of journalists that we've seen in modern history, seems like a great place to start.
Sharif, why do you think news organizations aren't taking up that advocacy mantle in the way that Trevor just described?
Well, I think we're a very long way from advocacy. My view is that most of the biggest and most powerful media institutions in this country and in Europe are enabling this killing to continue. And they're enabling it by the way they cover the killing.
Or don't cover.
Or don't no, but they do cover. And the problem is that it's more subtle and it's more insidious. And we've reached a stage where Israel is preemptively, in some cases, targeting journalists, saying they're going to kill them, assassinating them, and then bragging about it. And there's zero consequences. So how did we get here? Part of the reason we got here is the way big media institutions are covering these killings. So what they'll often do, and you alluded to this in your introduction, is Israel will claim that this journalist was in fact not a journalist and they were a terrorist. Big wire agencies like Reuters or the New York Times, massively powerful media institutions, will front load those claims. And then they'll have the denial by, say, Al Jazeera. So it becomes this he said, she said situation. And there's that old story of the duty or the role of a journalist. If you're sitting in a room and there's two people arguing about the weather, and one person says it's raining and the other person says it's not raining, your job is not to print those two statements. Your job is to look out the window and report the truth. They're not looking out the window. And I'll give you an example. When al-Sharif was assassinated on August 10th, the headline of Reuters was, Israel killed Al Jazeera journalist it says was Hamas leader. Okay, that's the headline. Then it front loads the claim in the first paragraph of the lead. And then it says Al Jazeera, which is funded by the Qatari government, rejected the assertion. I can keep going in this article, it's terrible. This is Reuters. Nasser Hospital was part of a Reuters team that won the Pulitzer Prize for photography in 2024. This is how they're treating their own journalists they've worked with who helped them win the Pulitzer Prize, by saying it's kind of up for debate. Israel is claiming this, and Al Jazeera, his employer, is denying it. Not that CPJ finds these claims unsubstantiated, not that the UN finds them unsubstantiated, Al Jazeera denies it. So, can you imagine if Hamas killed one of the most famous Israeli journalists and then said he was in fact a terrorist? Would Reuters cover it this way? Of course not. We know that they wouldn't. You mentioned Evan Gershkovich. We know they can be unequivocal in their coverage. when Evan Gershkovich was sentenced, the headline of the New York Times is, Evan Gershkovich sentenced to 16 years in Russian prison on fabricated charges. There's no equivocation.
Yeah.
It's said plainly. That's journalism, it's true. So somehow Palestinian journalists are lesser deserving of this.
Yeah.
And this has enabled Israel to continue. And if we look, there has been a progression in how they're killing journalists. In the beginning, I mean, in most cases, they would either not say anything about the killing of a journalist. Sometimes they would say, with Hamza Dahdouh actually, they initially said it was a mistake. Journalists should not be killed. They were operating a drone. We thought they were militants. We bombed them. Then they changed their story and produced a ridiculous document claiming that Hamza Dahdouh was in fact a militant with, I think, Islamic Jihad. A ridiculous document. But because there's no consequences either from their Western backers who fund and arm them, there's also no consequences in how it's covered. You don't get a breaking news alert on your phone that this happened. Perhaps the worst case that I can think of was the killing of Hassan Aslayah. Hassan Aslayah was a veteran journalist in Gaza, working there for years. Everyone knew him. Most of you probably haven't heard of him, but he was like a mentor to many journalists in Gaza. Israel started to openly hunt him and target him. They bombed in April a media tent outside Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, okay, to kill him. They said they bombed this tent to kill him. They didn't kill him. He lost 2 of his fingers and he was burnt. They killed 2 other journalists. I don't know if some of you remember, there's a haunting image of one of the journalists sitting upright, being engulfed in flames. They didn't say anything about that. Hassan is in hospital, in Nasser Hospital, recovering. Barely 3 weeks later, they bombed the hospital to kill him, the journalist that they tried before and who's wounded. And then they bragged about it. And then they said the line that they said after they killed my colleague, Hossam Shabet, don't let the press vest fool you. How is this not a massive story? How are news institutions then not outraged by this killing of their colleagues? This puts all of us in danger. Forget if you don't care about Palestinians, you don't care about Arabs. I mean, this endangers journalists everywhere. And so I would argue that these institutions, and they still do it. I was so angry after Enes's killing because, and no one even talked about the other 5 journalists. We're all arguing over whether Enes is a militant. You killed another 5 journalists. And so the coverage has been atrocious and insidious in this way because it's about the framing of it.
I want to ask you, well, 2 things. The first is really, you mentioned your colleague, Hossam. Hossam al-Shifa was one of those who was put on this list preemptively. He was then targeted and killed. When he was killed, Israel bragged about it. They said he was eliminated. You knew him. You worked with him. You edited him. You talked to him. I've looked at the coverage of his killing. There actually was not a news story about him in the New York Times. There was an op-ed, but there was never a news story. And you would think that the targeting and killing of a journalist who now is eliminated, somebody who worked even for Western outlets, somebody you knew closely, can you tell them about what your experience was like talking to him, what he underwent to do the coverage that he did, his own understanding of the fears and threats against him, and what he asked for in terms of protection?
I was very fortunate to be able to work with Hossam. He was mostly a correspondent for Al Jazeera Mubashir, but heard through a friend that he was looking for other work, and I reached out to him. I worked for Dropsite News, and he was extremely excited to be able to work with another outlet and especially have it translated. Hossam was one of a handful of journalists who never left the north, like Anas al-Sharif and Abdelkader Sabbah, who now left for the first time, by the way, because of Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza City. Hossam endured the unimaginable, like everyone in Gaza. He suffered everything that he was covering. He was displaced 20 times. He said he was exhausted. He was extremely hungry. He didn't have enough to eat. He buried many friends. He buried many of his colleagues. He was angry. There was an airstrike in December that killed 5 journalists. And so I messaged, it was in the north, somewhere near him, so I messaged to check in on him. And he wrote to me, I forgot exactly, but the translation would be, I hate this world. Nobody cares about us. I swear I've come to hate this job. And he said that we call ourselves martyrs already. But he also was incredibly warm and funny, would joke with me all the time. And I think it was a kind of rebellion against all the death around him to maintain this attitude. He was getting direct threats from Israeli military officials on his phone. He would get his pin location messaged to him on WhatsApp so they know, to let him know that he's there. I can't even begin to imagine how terrifying that is. He refused to go south, and he stayed in the north. In October, he was put on what was essentially a hit list, 6 journalists, all with Al Jazeera Mubashir and al-Sharif with Al Jazeera. And the Israeli military spokesperson was calling him out by name, saying he's going to kill him. And at the time, he said he felt like he was being hunted. And nevertheless, he continued. And then on March 24th, just a few hours before he was killed, he was messaging with me, also joking with me, saying he filed a story that we had agreed on. And he said, when is it going to go up? I said, Hassem, it's late. I need to translate it and edit it. He said, oh, I'm going to put it up in Arabic. I said, no, come on, wait. And so then I read it quickly. I sent him some questions. He answered a couple. I went to bed. I woke up. I sent him some more questions. He had been killed. The Israeli military bombed his car as he was driving in Beit Lahia. They blew his legs off his body, and he was dead. And what haunts me also is I am powerless to protect him. And I also think, like, was my messages going off on his phone, in his pocket, on his legs that are blown off him? These things haunt me. And like so many journalists in Gaza, he's 23. He wrote a letter knowing that he's going to be killed, to be published after his death. And al-Sharif did this, Hossein did this, many others. And at the end he said, don't let the world look away, keep fighting until Palestine is free. And it's our job as journalists to not let the world look away from people like Hossein and what happened to him.
We've now talked about several instances of these very overt, publicly declared, targeted killings, where they've said, this person who has like a very demonstrated record of being a journalist, right? Like, where would they find the time even to do what they're accused of? I don't understand. Like, they're barely sleeping, they're starving, they're putting out story after story, they're desperately, all of my interactions with any journalist working in Gaza is that they don't rest. They're just trying to put this out, and they're paying for this with their lives. We've seen this happen again and again. CPJ has documented, I believe the number is higher now because you're also including, I think, this recent attack in Yemen. So beyond Gaza, we're seeing this spread across the world to journalists in Yemen. There were more than 30 killed the other week. We're seeing this happen, and yet, even then, historically, we have seen sanctions when, for example, Saudi Arabia, when they murdered Jamal Khashoggi, there were sanctions on Saudi officials. There have been sanctions when it comes to Russia or Belarus, other countries that have taken steps against journalists. There's also this question of ICC cases and the ability to prosecute for the deliberate targeting and killing of journalists. So Ken, I want to talk to you. What are the prospects for these kinds of cases? And why haven't we seen them come? Why haven't we seen sanctions, and why haven't we seen a case in the ICC?
Well, let me focus mainly on the prosecution question, because, I mean, sanctions, there's a genocide going on. So if you're going to impose sanctions, you'll pose it for genocide. But clearly it would be nice to see prosecutions for attacks on journalists. Let me put this in context, because it's actually a bit complicated. I mean, to begin with, every civilian is protected under international humanitarian law. So you can't deliberately shoot civilians, you can't indiscriminately bomb a civilian area, you can't even target a military target if the harm to civilians will be disproportionate, you can't starve civilians. This is true for every single civilian. Now, I think we recognize that nonetheless there are certain civilians that play important functions in war. So you especially need doctors and healthcare workers because people are getting severely injured and need healthcare. You need humanitarian workers because you've got to deliver food and water and other necessities to people. And you need journalists because journalists help to deter these kinds of war crimes by recording them. Everybody behaves better when they're being watched. And journalists accumulate evidence, to enable prosecutions down the road. So journalists, like doctors, like humanitarian workers, have an important function and role which does deserve protection. And while you can't say they deserve more protection than other civilians, what you can say, I think, is that it's worth it for prosecutors to highlight the targeting of journalists because of this special function, the special role that they play. Now, so that's, a proposition. Now let me introduce reality, because reality today is a little frustrating. The International Criminal Court, with respect to Gaza, has not even charged anybody for any shooting or any bombing. Okay, there are 2 Israelis who have been charged, Netanyahu, the prime minister, Gallant, the former defense minister. They're both charged for starving and depriving Palestinian civilians. Quite appropriate, that's the essence of the genocide. But nobody has been charged for firing anything. Okay. And obviously nobody's been charged for the genocide. The genocide case is in a different court, at the International Court of Justice, which is a civil case brought by South Africa. If the court decides the way I think it should decide, it will find there is a genocide, but that will be a civil ruling against the state of Israel. No individual will have been convicted by that. So you need the International Criminal Court to charge. They haven't done that. To make matters worse, the International Criminal Court is currently headless because Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, is facing sexual assault charges by a member of his staff, and so has been on leave since May. And I had a piece in Foreign Policy just a couple weeks ago with another colleague pushing the Assembly of States parties, basically the governing board of the ICC, to decide this thing already. I don't know what happened. If he did it, he should leave. If he didn't do it, he should stay. But the idea that you have the chief prosecutor who is just gone at this critical time is horrible. And they seem to be just dragging it on. I guess they must be negotiating it. Who knows? But there are 2 deputies who are nominally running things, but they don't have the stature or the political courage or inclination to pursue difficult cases. So, on a completely different matter, there is reportedly a case against Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the 2 far-right ministers, for expanding the settlements, maybe for settlement violence, in the West Bank, not Gaza. That's going nowhere because there's no chief prosecutor. Trump, with his sanctions, he's now sanctioned the chief prosecutor, the 2 deputies, 6 judges. This is quite clearly obstruction of justice. It is a crime under Article 70 of the Rome Statute, the governing statute of the ICC. Nobody's pursuing it because there's nobody in charge. So the idea that somebody would, first of all, you begin by charging indiscriminate bombardment, say the use of 2,000-pound bombs in heavily populated neighborhoods. You start with something like that, but then to get around to focusing on journalists or doctors or groups that deserve highlighting because of the special role they play, we are far from that. So I just, at the moment, don't have a lot of confidence in the ICC. There is another option which is worth keeping in mind, which is the use of universal jurisdiction. And this is a concept that says that for certain crimes, aggression, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, torture, these can be pursued in any national court where the legislature gives the prosecutors the power to do that. And various governments have good universal jurisdiction laws, Germany, Argentina, France. And so, one option, given how ineffective the ICC has been, would be for national prosecutors to pursue these cases. And you could even have a division of labor where, Germany takes indiscriminate bombardment and, France takes starvation and Argentina takes attacks on journalists, So this would be, a feasible way to do this. You still have to get people in the dock, but you have to get people in the dock for the ICC, too. You probably saw that, Netanyahu, when he flew to New York, he's speaking tomorrow at the General Assembly, he avoided going over Europe, so he wouldn't get arrested in case his plane had to land there. So, getting people in custody is always a problem. But, we faced this in the past. Slobodan Milosevic thought he was home free as president of Serbia. He ended up in The Hague. Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippines president, thought he had arranged his immunity by getting his daughter to be vice president. She had a falling out with the president. He's in The Hague. So things happen. People lose power. The new government comes in. It becomes, convenient if they want to stop being a pariah to hand over the war criminal to show that they're turning a new leaf, they're respecting the rule of law. So these are feasible, but you got to start off by charging. And I think that, bottom line is, it would be very worthwhile to spotlight attacks on journalists, but we have a lot of work to do on other parts of what's going on in Gaza too.
Just, you're describing this like these cases may not materialize today or in the near-term future. What should be happening in a time when evidence is being destroyed, when people are being killed, where the journalists who documented the killings of journalists are now being killed? What would you need to prepare? What kind of evidence collection is required? Like, how do you prepare for that case? Are we doing what we need to be doing even to be ready for a case like that?
Yeah, I don't think there is right now something comparable to what, for example, was created for Syria or for Myanmar, which is, in the case of Syria, it's called the Independent and Impartial Investigative Mechanism. I think for Myanmar, it's, I don't know, MMI. They have these funny names. But what they basically are is a body, the Syrian one was created by the General Assembly. The Myanmar one was created by the UN Human Rights Council. But their job is to collect the evidence, preserve it, and actually begin the analytic process and start putting cases together. And this is actually essential for universal jurisdiction. Because if you look at some of the Syrian prosecutions, like in Koblenz in Germany, there was a military commander of a torture center who was prosecuted and convicted because of help from the IIIM, this mechanism. So we need, ideally, a UN body that does this. It could be done privately too, but you're right, but the key is to recognize that just because we all know what's going on, that's not evidence. And you've got to put together evidence that a prosecutor can use down the road.
I just want to spotlight a piece that was in Dropsite News by a Columbia Journalism School graduate and brilliant investigative reporter, a former student of mine, Laila Hassan, who wrote an extraordinary piece about the race to document evidence of war crimes and the way that's being wiped out. And she has a great section on the history that Ken is referring to here when he describes the implementation of measures to archive and preserve for investigative purposes attacks on journalists elsewhere or attacks also on civilians elsewhere, and the lack of that in Gaza that I think is really worth your reading.
It's worth noting that the European Union is just, I think today, announced they're pushing for one of these similar mechanisms for Afghanistan. It's perfectly appropriate, but we need it for Gaza as well.
Absolutely. Let's step out into the issue of access, and we'll return more to Palestinian journalists in a moment. But since this war began, Israel and Egypt have not allowed foreign journalists access to Gaza. In the piece, one of the contributors reflected on how, in some ways, that's yielded, argumentatively, better coverage because you are free of. You really have people on the ground who know others, who are able to do this work, but it has resulted in incredible killing. The lack of protections for local journalists when compared with foreign journalists. One of the ideas in this feature that really broke my heart is that somebody suggested a buddy system. They said, for every Palestinian journalist on the ground, there should be a foreign journalist with them. They should sleep next to them, eat next to them, report next to them, because there's no greater form of protection. But foreign journalists can't get in. Israel has said that this is for security reasons. They've also not allowed anyone to get in during the ceasefires. I think that argument has rung hollow. But one of the primary means to contest that is the Foreign Press Association's court case that has been slowly moving through the Israeli courts, has been delayed on multiple occasions. Jody, can you talk a little bit about access, the push for access, that particular court case, and what the prospects look like?
Yes, so the only journalists from outside of Gaza that have been allowed in are allowed in on these very strict so-called embeds. And if you want to understand just how hollow this argument about safety is, you only need to look at the example of when they did, if you remember, they did these aid drops via planes, right? And they said, oh, foreign journalists can come. You can film us dropping the aid, but you cannot film the devastation that you are seeing below. And in fact, Jeremy Bowen, the BBC correspondent, talks about this in one of his pieces, about the kind of utter madness of, he described exactly what he saw, but they were prevented from filming it. And that just, shows you that this is not about safety. It's not about keeping journalists safe. It's entirely about controlling what we can and can't see as much as possible. And so a number of different efforts have been tried. There have been lots of joint appeals. In fact, yesterday at an event that we hosted, the BBC premiered a video that it did together with AFP and AP and Reuters, again calling for independent media access. But potentially one of the best avenues that we have to actually bring that about is through the courts. And so the Foreign Press Association in Israel, which is obviously a group of correspondents from outside of Israel, have essentially gone to court to try and force the government to do it. There have been several delays. It will come back to court later. What month are we? September. It will come back to court next month. And I think this is one of these things where it got very little coverage, right? We need to give that maximum coverage. We need to give that maximum coverage, not because, and again, this is something that we get thrown back at us all the time, not because Gazan journalists can't do the job. Gazan journalists manifestly can do the job. They're being killed for doing the job. That isn't the issue. The issue is, in most wars, people covering wars have some ability, the journalists have some ability to cycle in and get respite. You've just heard, being moved 20 times, starving. Those journalists need some support, and also some people who are able to validate exactly what they're saying, so that we can, put paid to this lie that what they are showing us is untruthful. So I think one thing that we could usefully do is really give a lot of coverage and support to that court case, because I think, unfortunately, we're not seeing movement. Interestingly, international governments are now beginning to shift on this. So I think there is also a way to encourage governments to be essentially making international access, as well as the not killing of journalists, a condition of some of its dealings with Israel, to say, we are going to pull together a group of international journalists that have our backing, and they've got to go in the same way that we're letting aid workers go in or anything else. So I think there's a way as well to push governments to do more to insist that international journalists be given access, and that's something I think we can push more on.
Absolutely. I just, as a kind of task for you later, I would encourage you, for some of the things that we're talking about, I want you to just use Google News, and search for the coverage of that Israeli court case. You'll find it in Haaretz, you'll find it in Hebrew, you'll find it sometimes mentioned in Western media, but I want you to check some of your favorite news outlets, or some of the biggest news outlets, and just do cite, that news organization. I want you to put in quotes, look at the coverage or lack thereof. And I really think if you start, all of my students know I'm obsessed with databases. If you build a database and you analyze this coverage or lack thereof, if you put in the targeted journalists, for example, and you search for coverage or lack thereof, there are distinct patterns. And I think I really want to emphasize, what Sharif brought up, and what is coming up again and again, is that it's not just about advocacy here. There's a real dearth of even just coverage, and that is shocking to me.
And on that specific issue of lack of coverage, Sharif, you talked about being haunted. I mean, so we published a piece 2 weeks before Nasser al-Sharif was killed, specifically talking about the fact that he was being smeared and targeted and that he was being set up for murder. We said it very publicly. It got a lot of coverage in Arabic. I mean, I haven't done the Google search, but it was not a story that became a story until 2 weeks later, when suddenly I found myself being asked by every single news organization. I did 30 interviews in the space of 2 days because we had written about it 2 weeks before. Nobody covered it 2 weeks before, but suddenly it became a big story for everybody because in part it was so brazen and Israel murdered 6 journalists and couldn't even be bothered to explain why 5 of them were justified. But it became something that people were asking us about because we'd written that story, but they didn't cover the story 2 weeks before. And it's heartbreaking to think that you've done something that we thought was going to help protect him, and it didn't protect him.
On access, we've seen some movement on, for example, flotillas, right? These ships bound for Gaza, intended to break the siege, and at times we've had journalists aboard. There have been, from the very first that I think Greta Thunberg was on, there were Al Jazeera journalists aboard that flotilla bound for Gaza. I've heard that there was a CNN journalist who wanted to go to document this, whose editors, or whose higher ups said no. You can't go. We haven't seen Western journalists, for the most part, on these kinds of efforts, but we have seen actually a drop site editor was on the latest flotilla, which also, by the way, I would encourage you. There's a very conspicuous. Clearly, I've built the database, but I really would encourage you to look at the coverage of the latest flotilla that left, I think, 2 weeks ago from Spain, or 3 maybe now. Look at the coverage of who covered it setting sail and who didn't, because I think that's quite telling. But there is a drop site editor aboard that flotilla. Can you tell us a little bit about the decisions that went into putting them on what is, a very likely risky endeavor, and also, poses a lot of challenges in many ways? What went into that decision and why?
Well, I think if you think about it in 2 parts, one is, security is one thing. And I think that as reporters, if you're working in conflict zones, there are measures you take, what's manageable risk, what isn't. There's risk, there's no question. But we decided there was manageable risk and he wanted to go. The decision to put a reporter on the boat, I think the question should be, why shouldn't you? How is this? Forget politics. Forget what you think of the tactic or the strategy. Just as a journalistic practice, is this not newsworthy? This is dozens of boats with parliamentarians on it, mayors, in addition to activists, engaged in this action. It's newsworthy. It's in the public interest. So you should have a reporter on it. If we were invited, had a place, okay, we'll send one. To the extent that, they're being attacked in different ways. It's unclear exactly what's happening, but they are being attacked. To the extent that Italy and Spain are now sending naval ships to escort them. It's a huge story. I think the question is, if you don't have a reporter on the boat, then I would say that's a political decision, because I can't understand how it's a news decision. And yes, it's very worrying. Israel has killed people on flotilla in 2010 in the Mavi Marmara. One would hope that the scale and kind of the high-profile people on the boat would help protect from that. There's only so much you can do in security-wise. It is a risk. But again, part of the job is to have to manage risk and to take on risk. And yeah, so we decided, and he's been on the boat for like 3 weeks now. So yeah, it's been a while.
In the feature that we published, Yumna El-Sayed, the Gaza Strip correspondent for Al Jazeera English, puts forth a really clear point that journalists should be pushing on the ground. She, in our conversation, she had talked about examples of when that had been done. When journalists have, through various means, managed to get in. And there's one journalist who got in unembedded into Gaza. But she said one of the reasons why Western news organizations aren't really pushing as hard as they could be, in our conversation, she said, was the fact that it's a recognition of how dangerous it really is on the ground. That it is that monumentally dangerous, it is almost certain death to get in. And so they're not pushing for that reason. The lack of access is almost an admission of how dangerous it is. And Leila, I know that's something that resonated with you, that you're seeing. But I also want to talk a little bit about, okay, if honestly a boat for like several weeks with a lot of different people versus maybe trying on land, right? Like it's something that like baffles my mind is how have not correspondents in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem tried the land convoy route, to go to the border, which, is safer. It is people who are already on the ground. You are going to the border where embeds are facilitated. Why hasn't something like that happened, and how do you evaluate or think through the effectiveness of trying to break the access barrier that way?
I think it's something that should happen, should be arranged. There should be an effort. Like I mentioned, it's long overdue, frankly. But I think if you look at who actually, the group of people that has been able to enter Gaza, which is medical workers and doctors and aid workers, and what they say when they leave, it's very telling. My program, Frontlines, did an episode called Kids Under Fire about the deliberate shooting of children in Gaza, based on interviews with doctors and nurses and medical workers, and all of them said, they'd had experience in Haiti and Ukraine and conflict zones all over the world, and they all came back saying, like, how haunted they were and how it was the worst place they'd ever been, and the, most brutal violence they'd ever witnessed. It was just unspeakable. And I think it's very clear, as Jody mentioned, that Israel's trying to control the narrative and to make sure that that perspective doesn't come out. I think in terms of what journalists can do that involves, still getting more reporting on the ground, look no further than this own campus. When there was encampments and protests, CNN and other news organizations literally worked with student journalists on this campus, had them on live because they couldn't come to campus to tell them what was happening. Why aren't they doing that with journalists in Gaza? I mean, this is something that's so simple and doable. Al Jazeera doesn't. That, CNN and all these other news organizations can do much more effectively. They choose not to. And finally, I think about what Arwa Damon said in the piece about one pressure point that could be employed. She's a former CNN war correspondent that hasn't been, frankly, is to tell the Israeli military and government, well, if you're still refusing us access, then we won't be having your spokespeople on our air. Because they're given ample airtime to spin their own narratives. And these news organizations have tremendous leverage. They're just not exercising it. And they need to do a lot more, and they should have done a lot more far sooner.
Trevor, do you know of an instance in which news organizations have leveraged their own coverage, for example, to say, like, actually, we're not going to quote you, or we're not going to, like, advocacy in that way through the pages of their journalism where they maybe repudiate a source or abstain from one as they attack the press?
I don't know of a specific instance of them saying, we're not going to quote you, especially when it comes to government officials. But you can definitely tell in the amplification and the intensity of their coverage when they are pushing for something and when they're not. I mean, this happened in a domestic press freedom sense at the beginning of the Biden administration, actually. So, it was revealed at the beginning of the Biden administration that the Trump the Trump one had been spying on various journalists. They'd gotten email and phone records of New York Times and Washington Post and CNN journalists. and actually the Biden administration, at least in some of these cases, were continuing on trying to gather these records on these journalists. But once this became public, it turned in, and I think this happened on like a Friday night, it turned into a firestorm where journalists were outraged that even though Biden had been talking about how journalism is not a crime, and we had just lived through 4 years of Trump, insulting journalists on a daily basis. So not only was it covered in every major news organization, but the White House was being peppered with questions about it at their daily briefing. So was the Justice Department, and every prominent journalist was incessantly tweeting about it. And essentially by Monday morning, the White House had taken so much flack that they announced that they were going to actually change the policy of the Justice Department, that they were going to drop these cases, that they were going to write very stringent rules that would say that journalists couldn't be surveilled. So they do know what levers to push when they actually want to. There is a huge difference between writing a single story and making it essentially not just all of your coverage, but the questions that you're asking politicians. The problem is this issue is impervious to all other condemnations like that. I mean, when you think, obviously with the Trump administration, they're giving Israel a blank check, but as Jody was talking about before, in the Biden administration, all of the press freedom organizations went to the Biden administration repeatedly, publicly and privately, pleading with them, condemning them in public, and they barely moved an inch, whereas on virtually every other public issue, those types of condemnations could work. And what makes this more, I don't know if it's fascinating or depressing, is that public opinion on this of the general U.S. public has shifted dramatically. Mm-hmm. Like, you could not pick an issue with which you could see poll numbers change so much in 1 year or 2 years, and yet it doesn't matter at all to the U.S. government. And so I think that's why you're seeing a lot of organizations and a lot of pressure now go to European countries who are, their governments are less broken than ours and are more susceptible to public pressure.
Did you?
I just want to say something quickly on access. I'm not sure that it's fair to say that large media organizations are not pushing. I know several that are pushing very hard for access. One of the things that is complicating this situation is, of course, there are many who want to get people out, and Israel control that too. And so you're doing all the time a very difficult and delicate dance where you're pushing to get people in, but you're also in some cases begging and pleading with the Israeli government to let people out so they can have medical treatment. I mean, the complexity of getting people out of Gaza is just, I mean, we would take another 2 hours just to talk about the kind of Byzantine process, again, which is part of the deliberate tactic, to get people out just so they can have basic medical aid for very, very serious injuries and casualties. And so I think, just those are some of the things that have to happen kind of quietly, and why some people have, I think, been unwilling to do a lot of things publicly, at least initially, because there were very intense negotiations going on to try and get people to safety, certainly in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Jody, I want to touch on some ideas that you mentioned in an August op-ed in The Guardian, when you were talking about actions on the table, or should be on the table. And I believe the language you used was that whereas the Committee to Protect Journalists received significant offers of support and solidarity when journalists were being killed in Ukraine at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, the reaction from international media over the killings of our journalist colleagues in Gaza at the start of the war was muted at best. In some high-profile killings, such as that of the Reuters journalist Issam Abdullah, some governments trotted out well-worn defenses of press freedom, but stopped well short of seriously censuring Israel, and few took any concrete steps, such as the halt of arms sales or the suspension of trade agreements that might have forced Israel to change course. I want to ask about those two things that are, being pushed for the killings of civilians generally, But I'm curious to understand from you and from Ken the extent to which the halt of arms sales or the suspensions of trade agreements have taken into account the killings of journalists as part of their understanding of human rights violations.
So most countries, when they have weapons agreements or trade agreements, have conditionality on them, particularly around weapons use, about that, you must not use this to target civilians or, to commit, to breach international humanitarian law. That we have all of those. They're just not being used. Whenever we talk about this, there's a lot of kind of hand-wringing about what can we do? And if only we could speak out more, and if only, and all of those things are important. But I think ultimately, this will only be stopped when Israel stops committing genocide that's being enabled because all of the other governments in the world are refusing to do anything that would stop that, ultimately. And Ken's point is right, the journalists, of course, are a key part of this, but this is part of a much bigger thing. And if we want this to stop, governments will have to stop enabling Israel to violate international humanitarian law. And there's only a few levers that are going to actually do that, right? One is the provision of weapons, and the other is trade. So we've been pushing very hard for a long time, for example, for the EU to revise its trade agreement with Israel, because under the terms of that trading agreement, Israel is clearly already in contravention of those terms. It's already in contravention of the Leahy law and so on in the US, but we're not seeing any action from the US. So it's got to be us putting pressure on them to actually uphold their responsibilities in dealing with governments that are systematically committing war crimes, violating human rights. And they do it in other places, we're just not seeing it here.
I want to ask Ken, but just to let you know, there's a microphone in the back, so in a minute we're going to start taking questions. So if people want to start lining up, you can please begin to do so now. But Ken, you have an entire chapter in your latest book that came out earlier this year about Israel and your experience at Human Rights Watch in the context of pushing for these changes. How much has changed now since October 7th when it comes to not just the United States, but some of these international governments and movements in the context of what Jody is describing?
Well, I think we have to recognize that there has been huge movement in the rest of the world, leaving aside the United States. And I don't think anybody is selling arms to Israel anymore other than the US. Germany isn't even doing that. There's, some countries are, still selling components of the S-35 that goes to Israel, but, that's just so attenuated. It's hard to get that halted, and it's such a multilateral effort. But any direct sales are done with, but for the United States. So the real issue in Europe, as Jody's alluding to, is the trade benefits. And as I understand, to just kind of rip up the trade agreement would require unanimity, which Hungary would block. But to suspend trade benefits under the agreement can be done with a so-called qualified majority, where so long as Germany goes along, which is not yet clear, it could be done. And a couple of weeks ago, von der Leyen, the European Commission president, she said that they're going to move toward doing this. So there is a certain momentum, but it hasn't happened yet. That would wake up the Israelis. Now, in this country, obviously, Trump is continuing the $3.8 billion in annual U.S. military assistance. He's continuing the arms sales. I don't think we should give up on Trump, because there actually has been a number of steps he has taken to distance himself from Netanyahu. And some of these are not directly about Gaza. He lifted the sanctions against the new Syrian authorities when Netanyahu didn't want that. He cut a deal with the Houthis where they stopped attacks at sea but didn't stop attacking Israel. That was okay with Trump. He has now condemned the attack on the Hamas negotiators in Qatar. He has repudiated Netanyahu's false denial that there's starvation in Gaza. He's twice imposed temporary ceasefires. So there have been a series of steps he's been willing to take. But at the same time, this is the guy who envisions the Gaza Riviera and is endorsing the far-right vision of, Gaza without any Palestinians, mass ethnic cleansing. So how do you move Trump? I mean, obviously one option is what he's aspiring to, a Nobel Peace Prize. You don't get a Nobel Peace Prize for ethnic cleansing. So, we can, to some extent push him in that direction. If this is what you want, then you got to put pressure on Netanyahu. I think, though, in a more immediate sense, Trump's top priority is always himself. And he has to see this very significant movement among the American public about Israel. And not just among Democrats, where Democrats have really turned on Israel, but even among Republicans, sometimes among MAGA Republicans. So I think we should not give up on this political dynamic. We should continue talking about the genocide. I think of more relevance here today to this panel. We should talk about the cover-up of the genocide. Why are they covering up genocide? Why is Trump okay with them covering up genocide? These are, questions that are very worth asking. I think we should not be defeatist about this. And it's obviously taking much too long, but the only way we're going to stop this is either, Netanyahu succeeds with his aim, which is to commit genocide until they get rid of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, and then they turn to the West Bank, or there's enough pressure put on him to stop. And the only person capable of doing that is Trump. So we've got to focus on Trump.
All right, questions? Roman.
Is it? Okay, good. Hi, thank you so much, all of you, for the work that you've been doing and for being here for us. I'm a former student of Osmat's and a freelance investigative journalist. Like most people, I have an uncle, and like most uncles, he's nuts and sends me lots of just horrible things all the time. Middle Eastern guy, so, But this is directed towards the CPJ, and I really have appreciated everything that you said today and the work that the CPJ has been doing, so please don't take this as some sort of condemnation. But with Israel's delegitimization campaign of journalists, both proactively and then after the fact, saying that these are Hamas militants, that some 28-year-old journalist joined when he was 14 and is like a commander of a rocket brigade or whatever, I've had a little bit of difficulty pushing back against, and I think this is true in general of our society, where Israel will go very forcefully and say, we have all this evidence, we have, and they have nothing, but then the CPJ says it's unsubstantiated, which is, I don't know, personally feels like not as forceful. And is there something more that the CPJ could say or do to just outright say that Israel is lying, that they're making something up, that this is just, fake? Or is that kind of just not in your, control?
It's not in my control because we can't say that because we don't know. I mean, we say what we know, which is we cannot verify this. That they are making these claims and we can't verify them. But I can't say this is definitely a lie because I don't know that it's definitely. We can't see any of this evidence. So every single one of those things that you talk about, where they produce these sorts of sheets and everything else, we can say as much as we know. The one Sharif talked about, I think, was not even written in proper, it doesn't even seem to be written in proper Arabic, the document that you were referencing. So we can say all of those things. We can say as much as we know. We don't know what it, we haven't been able to see this document. The document looks dodgy. The document shows that this person would have been 10 years old when they became a Hamas commander. All of those things we know. We can't say this is definitely a lie because I don't have the documents in front of me to be able to do that or the evidence to be able to do that. I can say as much as we know, and that's what we do, is to say this is not credible. And we go through why, as much as we can, why it's not credible.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. This is sort of a related question, but I was thinking about the strategy in pushing back against the slander of journalists, and when do you kind of try to deny the fact, their claims that someone was part of Hamas 10 years ago? And when do you say, it doesn't even matter if they were part of Hamas, now they're a journalist, you still can't kill them? And when do you just say, well, all of their claims are kind of, not really based, many of them in reality? What do you dismiss as, what do you engage with as an accusation, and what do you just say when this isn't even worth responding to? And then I was also wondering with the CPJ's numbers of journalists killed. I think there are around, the UN counts about 50 journalists more who've been killed in Gaza, and how you decide, or how does CPJ decide who's a journalist, who's been killed, and also if like, now that everyone is like documenting, or so many people who are not like traditional journalists are documenting what's happening, do we need to like expand who is a journalist?
Okay. I'm going to go backwards in the hope that I remember the first ones. Okay. So engaging with smears. This is a really interesting thing, right? Because part of the issue with smears is if you repeat it, if you keep talking about it, then you're often giving oxygen, right? So, we made a very conscious decision about Nasser Hospital because we were so concerned at the volume that it needed to be called out. We actually, there are a number of those cases where we've done something similar. In terms of the journalist question, so all of the different organizations have different ways of doing it. Some exclude entirely any journalists who work for organizations that even have links to Hamas funding, so their numbers are much lower. Other people have higher numbers because they have different ways of considering what is a journalist. We consider people to be journalists if they're engaged in fact-based news gathering and dissemination, and the numbers that we have are the numbers we have been able to verify, and that's really important. What is really important to say, and this was the point you were making, is that's become harder and harder. That's become harder and harder for us to be able to do because the people that we would go to get information are often themselves killed or their families are killed, and we need at least two sources to be able to say this person was a journalist, this is the work that they did. So that sometimes explains some of the numbers as well. There was another question you asked about smearing, but I can't remember what it was.
Can I just I want to touch on something because I think it's a post 9/11 enduring quality in the psyche that you alluded to when you were talking about evidence and assessing and disputing something. But essentially, the way that these accusations are functionally allowed to work is that you are declared guilty unless you can prove yourself innocent. And how do you prove yourself innocent from an accusation you can never see? It's secret evidence in so many ways. And even while there is so much evidence of your being a civilian, of your being a journalist, of your doing work on air, story after live streaming, writing, that evidence exists. The level of evidence required in the post 9/11 psyche for declaring somebody a terrorist is so low. But the evidence to clear one's name is so high. This came up again and again in my reporting on civilian casualties in places like in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and now the West Bank and in Gaza, is that to show yourself innocent is next to impossible when you don't see the evidence against you. So to refute it in this psyche where that accusation reigns is you are guilty until proven innocent and there's no way to prove your innocence in that context is really wild. You need to, the burden of proof should be there to prove guilt, not innocence, right? Like it should be flipped. And I think that's core to understanding or talking about any of these allegations. It's why I didn't, when Sharif brought up Hassan Islay, what I didn't say was when he was covered, because he was covered, the way he was covered was they put an image of him getting kissed, by Yahya Sinwar, and that was used as evidence of his guilt. Like that was all the evidence anyone needed when they covered him to say, no, this is not a journalist. And that was all it took for people to accept that and to reprint it or not to cover it. And I think it's really about changing that, understanding that that switch has taken place and that wouldn't work in any courtroom.
Sorry, I've remembered what the other bit of the question was, which was if they had been members of Hamas or whatever, would that still... This is a really big thing, right? Because this is used all the time. There was a picture of them kissing someone from Hamas. I'm sure there are plenty of Western journalists that have met members of Hamas. They're not being accused of terrorists for having met members of Hamas. I've met, Jerry Adams. It doesn't mean that I'm a member of the IRA. That's used all the time. But to this point about if you were a member of Hamas, this is used all the time, right? And again, the law is very clear. Only active combatants are legitimate targets. So even if you were in the pay of a militant organization, you have to be an active combatant to be a legitimate target. So being sympathetic to the Hamas cause or to the Houthi cause or whatever does not make you a legitimate target. And this is being deliberately kind of conflated, again, to make everyone think, well, sympathy equals terrorist equals legitimate target.
Yeah, I would also add, you can find many journalists smiling next to Netanyahu, a man who's convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and has an arrest warrant and is an international fugitive, right? Charged. CNN just hired as a senior correspondent in Jerusalem an Israeli reporter. She has photos of herself next to a tank, an Israeli tank, and says, I have a weak spot for tanks. These are the exact type of photos that if a Palestinian journalist was next to a rocket launcher or something like that, that's it for that journalist. They're going to get murdered. And people will justify it because of that photo. So you can't kill someone because you don't like their politics.
Hi, I'm Tom Much. I'm a journalist student here at the J School. I'm also a freelance reporter, and I spent a month living in Ramallah, which is what where I develop my own views on this. I wanted to say first, thank you so much for putting this event on. It's a really, really important event. I think most of us here would agree that the continued murder of journalists in Gaza is the greatest crime against press freedom that I think that's happened anywhere within any of our lifetimes. But I wanted to ask, my first question is a little bit procedural, because when the CPJ talks about the 26 cases that they've said these are the murders of journalists, how do you determine that from just someone who is a media worker who was killed? Can you maybe take us through one of the cases where you were like, okay, we got this video evidence and we got this evidence of intent that they might be targeted? Because I think that would be really interesting. The second question I have is one that's more open to the panel. It's like one of the points of the talk is ideas for how we can change things. Well, there's all this stuff, for instance, about, say, we need to keep raising awareness. What does raising awareness practically mean for people who, I don't know, might be freelance reporters or activists or something like that? One thing that came to my mind when you were talking earlier, for instance, about a buddy system. Why can't we have something like a virtual buddy system? I'd be very, very happy, and I'm sure you'd be able to find dozens of journalists who at the drop of the hat would be very happy to be connected, honoured to be connected with a reporter in Gaza. And you don't have to be super strident about it. You can just say, this is who he or she is, this is what they do every day, this is who they've lost and buried in this awful slaughter. And I wondered if you had any other ideas of just what we can do as a practical matter to get this issue more oxygen.
On the targeting question, so in some cases it's easy because Israel is, as we've just heard, quite happy now to admit that it's murdering journalists. The attack on the Al Jazeera journalist in Gaza City is a very good example, right? So that's procedurally they've made it kind of easy for us. Nasser Hospital, similarly, in other cases, for example, such as the murder of Issam Abdullah in the attack on Lebanon, what you need to prove is that it's reasonable to assume. So we're not a court, right? This is not a legal, it's not a legal analysis, but that it was reasonable to assume that Israel would have known that they were journalists, right? And the Lebanon case is really easy because everyone was working for a spot that was known to be a place from which journalists operated. They were high up, they could easily be seen. They're all wearing press vests with cars that say press on them. There is no way that and it was a targeted attack. In some of these other ones, it's much more complicated because the journalists are murdered in a say an indiscriminate bombing, which is still potentially under international humanitarian law, as Ken has explained, a war crime. But it doesn't mean that individual was being attacked for being a journalist, which is what we're, that how we think about murder in that sense, which is a kind of sounds like a weird technicality, but we're thinking about, are they being targeted for their work as opposed to because they were Gazan?
Well, I'll just make a few general comments. I mean, so we actually just put up on our site, we have a new action center with which you can contact your member of Congress. We actually wrote a message, and we're actually, in the next couple of weeks, going to have a call tool that you can use to express your concern, not just about the situation in Gaza in particular, but or in general, but in particular the treatment or the killing of journalists by the Israeli military. I just want to make a couple general comments because Osmond brought up 9/11, and I think that is one of the most infuriating things about this whole debate is that for the past 2 decades, we have, as a country, collectively realized, some of us early and some of us a lot later, that the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq was an absolute calamity. That we destroyed rights here in the United States. We tortured people abroad. We created far more terrorists than we ever killed, and we left countries in ruin. And presidents of both parties, Barack Obama first in his condemnation of the Iraq War, and then Donald Trump the first time also beating George Bush's brother, basically on the basis that he claimed, at least at the time, that he was against the Iraq War. Yet what we are seeing now is just a total repeat of what happened at that time. Yet is in many ways 10 or 100 times worse in the amount of destruction that we're seeing, and that we're seeing, even in the United States, student protesters who are protesting genocide being labeled Hamas supporters with zero evidence whatsoever, just because they care about civilians on the ground. And I think, CPJ in particular deserves a lot of credit for the documentation that they have done, because they haven't just been doing it these last few months or this last year as public opinion has shifted on this. They started right away. And I think the only way to analogize the environment when it comes to free speech after the October 7th attacks is to compare it to 9/11, where George Bush was smearing anybody who dared talk about civil liberties as al-Qaeda supporters or Saddam Hussein supporters.
Because I know we have a lot of people lined up for questions and we're approaching 8. So why don't we have you guys go 2 at a time, and then maybe we can, but go ahead, Chris.
Hi everyone, my name is Chris. I'm an ex-student of Professor Khan. I also work with Palestine Nexus, which is this outlet that publishes stories by Palestinians in Gaza about Gaza. And I think that's an interesting point, because a lot of these people are just becoming journalists. So as many journalists are being killed, you see these generations of people who are deciding to use journalism as a way to bear witness. So I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about that, even what it means to be a journalist now. I mean, we have all these people that are sharing information. They're not professional, but they are doing the work of journalism. But really also the question for Sharif or anyone else who wants to answer is, how do you deal with your journalists on the ground? How do you ask questions that you know are going to traumatize them even more when they're already traumatized? How do you manage people that are going through this?
Good question. It's very difficult. I think my primary difficulty is what I said before about Hussam, that I have no way of protecting them. And I'm always terrified when they are usually the ones telling me, I want to cover this. What do you think? So, at some point I was saying, whatever you want to do, we'll publish. We can talk about how to do the story, but maybe just don't. At some point I was telling them not to move. Do it on the phone. The problem is in Gaza, there's no safety anywhere, right? There's no safety anywhere. And someone like, I've been working very closely with Abdelkader Sabah, who's a videographer. So he goes regardless. He sends me footage and interviews, and I turn them into a print piece. And I was terrified for him. He'd never left the north, and he kept saying, I'm not going to leave, I'm not going to leave. It's not to me as someone far away to tell him what to do, but I kept telling him, maybe are you considering going to Dir al-Balah? He eventually went. That, for him to go to Dir al-Balah was an indication of how bad what's happening in Gaza City now. And so I feel like a major thing is to just always be checking in. I think for most Palestinians in Gaza, to know that people outside are remembering them is massive. And people, including reporters, sometimes get embarrassed because you feel so bad you don't know what to say. But I think that it's very important to stay in touch with them frequently. And so I try to do that every day with the people that I work with. And then, Anas al-Sharif wasn't an experienced reporter when this started. He had done a couple of things as a producer, but he became this, after Walid Dahduh left, because he was wounded, became the most well-known reporter in Gaza. And yeah, I think with Hussam, I was doing a lot of back and forth editing with him. He had a very different style of reporting. He's used to being a TV correspondent, and he wrote in this very evocative way in Arabic that I struggled a lot to translate into something relatable in English. And I needed more sourcing than he was used to, but it was a back and forth with them. And I think, like anyone, you learn as it's happening. But we're also, we're witnessing, I think, the most heroic act of journalism we've ever seen, right? These reporters continue to do this work because they believe in it. And they're most likely going to be killed. They know that. And somehow they continue to do it. So I'm always in awe, and I feel honored to be able to work with them.
Layla, I know you've also been working with journalists on the ground. We've screened in multiple events, like many of the films that you've done. If you can just add a little bit about the conversations you're having, the support you're giving, and anything students in the room, it also relates to the earlier question, the buddy system thing. I think once in a Freedom of Press Foundation board meeting, Tim, you and I were kind of talking, Trevor, you and I were kind of talking about this idea of even just these digital alliances that can be helpful in the sharing and spreading of news. But Layla, what can we do?
I think all of us feel in some ways quite helpless at this moment, the worse it gets. But I would say uplifting their work, making sure they're not forgotten. There's major shadow banning happening on social media. So I think the more people insist on breaking that shadow ban and really uplifting the work, sharing it, reaching out. I mean, some of them can be a bit suspicious about foreign numbers because they're being tracked and harassed and all of that. But sending them messages on social media, it means so much to hear from people that they care. I also know that we've spent so much time, rightfully so, talking about journalists in Gaza, but journalists in the West Bank are also under tremendous pressure. Just in the film that Sharif and I worked on together with our colleague Kavitha and Singali about the killing of Shireen Abu Aqla, 2 of the journalists in that film are now in prison under horrific conditions. They were both from Jenin, the West Bank town of Jenin, and they're both in prison right now. There's been also a massive crackdown on journalism in the West Bank. So making sure that people also reach out to journalists there and support their work, share it, as well as any news organization like Drop Site News, like Al Jazeera, that's actually doing the work that we're all talking about. So supporting them as much as possible.
Can we do just 3 of you ask your questions in a row, please? Thanks.
Okay, hi. I'm a 2016 graduate of journalism school here, and I come from a completely different perspective, perhaps. I am based here in New York, but also work between here and Japan, and I serve as the co-chair of Freedom of Press Committee of this Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. And in Japan, we also want to highlight what's going on in Gaza. My question is, we obviously rely on Jodi's organization for stats, and she kindly spoke at one of our Freedom of Press Awards ceremony online 2 years ago. When you want to do something more than issuing statements, like in our case, there was one specific real case, very quickly, if I may just explain to you. We do get requests to speak at our club, and when we are deciding, especially from foreign governments, we take votes. So here's what happened, and I want to ask everybody in the panel how they would vote. One thing is, we were asked by the Knesset, the Israeli parliament speaker, to come and speak with hostage family. And so one part of the Freedom of the Press Committee and the club voted yes. The other part basically did not want this. How would you vote if somebody from the Israeli embassy wanted to approach you? And we also invited the Palestinian ambassador, by the way. So how would you have voted as a press organization if you wanted to say something more than just issuing a statement?
Okay, so also 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'll be quick. I think there's a lot of young journalists like myself. I'm a recent graduate of the Columbia program who deeply care about this, and there's communities of us. Beyond the work we can do as individuals, what can we do as groups and communities of young journalists, maybe those who don't have power as individuals but have power collectively, to help in any way possible?
And for Ken, what's the viability of bringing war crimes cases in universal jurisdiction against individual actors, like individual soldiers on leave? And then for the rest of the panel, is that would using our, for example, open source intelligence or open source investigative skills for that purpose, is there a place for that in journalism, or is that sort of crossing a line? Thanks.
I think it's very useful to identify particular soldiers who have committed atrocities in Gaza and to publicize that, because it's, we all know that following an illegal order is illegal. If your general tells you to commit a war crime, the fact you're ordered is not a defense. So if we, make Israeli soldiers think twice about following these orders, if they suddenly won't be able to vacation in Europe or wherever they want to go, because they suddenly are worried about prosecution, that's a good thing. That may help to deter misconduct.
And Claire asked about collective action, which also references something you talked about, Sharif, in the feature about striking workers. Can you get into some of those ideas too?
Yeah, I would say also on the open source, we've done a bit of that on DropSite, exposing particular soldiers, and sometimes it's quite easy because they're proud of it and putting it on social media. But yeah, I think it's worthy. In terms of collective action, I mean, this is unrealistic, I think, but part of the reason I think this can continue is because of this kind of coverage. And I really, really believe that if these powerful media institutions covered Gaza in general and the killing of journalists in particular in a different way, it wouldn't continue. And so one way would be for journalists working within these media institutions to take some kind of collective action, like a strike, calling for some kind of substantial policy change, editorial policy change. And we can discuss what that policy change can be. It can be a boilerplate disclaimer that anytime you're quoting the Israeli military, you say that they often fabricate claims, or say that Israel has killed more journalists than any other military in recent history, or that the Israeli military claim will not be up front in the lead, it'll be down low with the disclaimer. You can have different ideas about this. We've seen journalists, I mean, just recently, because of the Reuters coverage of Enas, a Reuters photographer did resign in protest. I understand that probably this won't happen because people want their jobs and it's very hard to get a job in journalism, but at some point, if this continues in this way and the coverage continues in this way, I think there's complicity that's happening. I have very good friends, and I think they're amazing reporters who work in legacy media institutions, and they're trying to change it from within. But at some point, I think there needs to be some kind of a sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, I think there may be some perception from just ordinary news readers that corporate media outlets are a monolith, and there are amazing reporters within bad institutions. And journalists individually within those news organizations, but especially collectively, can shape coverage. There are arguments about this particular issue at every major news organization internally going on every week, every day, even right now. And, you know, even if you feel like you can't do something that will explicitly put your job at risk, there are certainly ways to make your voice heard internally, which can shape ways things are covered, both large and small.
Hi, I'm Farah. I'm a former student here, and I'm a video producer at the Wall Street Journal. You are talking about the way the media frames Gaza, and I'm just curious, why do you think they do that? Like, what are the reasons why they front-load claims by the IDF or equate, you know, what they're saying is equal if it's not an equal situation?
I'll just go right now.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Fatima. I'm an investigative reporter and a former student of Professor Khan as well. And just since you were talking about standards, right, of that newspapers and portals should establish, one thing I've tried to do in my personal life is to actively not use the word war or conflict while talking about the situation, which I did here a couple of times even today. And I think if we actively normalize the usage of the word genocide, which expert after expert has called this, that might be helpful. And also secondly, like, for so much hand-wringing around like whether a journalist has any affiliation with Hamas or not, one revelation for me since coming to the United States has been to realize just the sheer number of American journalists working in mainstream American organizations who've previously served in the IDF, which is a clear conflict of interest, right? But in fact, Columbia Journalism School today announced that they are awarding the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and in this evocative praise that they've written for him, there's no mention of the fact that he has served in the IDF. So I just feel like, is that another thing we can do, that each time we are talking about like, oh, how X or Y newspaper or portal covered something badly, actively bringing out the conflict of interest, because it so very clearly is, right? It's not just a matter of slander, it's deliberately questioning their, just like how capable they are to cover this objectively. Yeah, just that.
I'll take I mean, your question about why, I think, is a very important and a long question, and they're not told to do this, so why do they do it? And it's not the first time we saw, as Trevor was saying, in the run-up to the war in Iraq, probably one of the biggest media failures in this country, right? Just laundering weapons of mass destruction claims that the administration would then repeat back and saying, oh, look, the New York Times is reporting this. And I think in general, it's because most of these big institutions in the United States I'm talking about, kind of like swim in the same water as the political spectrum of Washington and elites. And it's kind of like what water is to fish. They don't realize that they have wholly adopted establishment orthodoxy as the only kind of span of what is legitimate. So if you look at some issues, mostly social issues, like for reproductive rights, for example, or gun rights or LGBTQ plus rights, there's a big span of debate in Washington on these issues, and you see healthy coverage on the most part in most of these big media institutions. But on other issues, capitalism, foreign policy, where there's much more of a consensus in Washington, you see a much narrower kind of like frame of debate. And in Washington, it's cracking a bit, but in Washington, there's no more consensus than on Palestine, that Washington backs Israel. And I think this is what's mirrored in the coverage. And those things are all changing. Stuff is changing in Washington because of this groundswell of protest, but But I can only, I don't know if other people have opinions on this of why.
I have a more nefarious interpretation.
Okay.
It's not just subconscious because they're swimming in the sea. It's, for any major media, every article on Israel is scrutinized by pro-Israel groups, and they are sent very deliberate letters saying, why did you say this? Why didn't you, and it's dissected. And so they get that critique from the pro-Israel view on everything, and they internalize it. They don't get that systematic critique from a pro-Palestinian view. And people ask, what can you do? Scrutinize and write, especially groups of young journalists. That'd be a very good thing to do.
I have been seeing a lot of systematic analysis of U.S. media coverage by news organizations like Dropsite and others as well. I think there were reports recently put out by groups like Prism and others analyzing this kind of coverage. I'm seeing more of that. But I just want to point out, as an anecdote, something that Fatima brought up in the context of people with these histories of previous work experiences in foreign militaries and that not being disclosed. And it's not as simple as just the existence of that. It's also, and I'll give an example that a colleague Singali and I on the Overseas Press Club board spent a lot of time, before October 7th, trying to create an award in the name of Shireen Abu Akleh, somebody who was near and dear to so many journalists we know and to us. And one of the criticisms raised at one point by somebody who was extremely opposed to this idea was that at one point in time she had worked for a radio station that was affiliated with the Palestinian Authority. And that was seen as so damning that we could not create an award for a journalist who was shot directly hit while wearing a press vest openly, a famous, one of the most famous journalists in the Palestinian territories. This is somebody who is so well known. And that slight affiliation for a radio station affiliated with was a no-gamer. And it's not even just this question of, is it right for somebody to have this job? It's who that's allowed for and who it is not. And it's something I think that pervades that affiliation, that ability. It's just not equally applied. And it's not just a concept of disclaimers and what's allowed and what's not. It's who isn't and who don't we hear. And so I think, Layla, maybe you can answer this when the why, if there is systematic coverage, why is one considered more important? Why is...
I think back to this article in The New Yorker, which was an interview with Aaron David Miller, who previously served in different administrations. And he was asked about Biden, and he said, why do you think Biden doesn't care about Palestinian lives in so many words? And he said, he just doesn't have the same depth of feeling. And I think that's a euphemism for he just doesn't care about Palestinian life. And I think it's impossible to have this conversation without acknowledging that there's a deep dehumanization of Palestinians in our society that permeates every aspect of it, whether it's Capitol Hill or the White House or the power brokers, the lawmakers, or even our very powerful media institutions, particularly those shaping coverage. It's just, Edward Said, the Palestinian scholar who's a professor at this university, wrote a book about this, books about this decades ago. And much of, if you pick up that book, covering Islam and others, so much of what he writes still applies. And that kind of lack of feeling, that dehumanization, makes, as Edward Said writes, this group of people more susceptible to military aggression. And that's exactly what we see. And it's important that part of our work is to humanize, and I hate that word because they are human, but is to cover them as we would any other group of people and uplift their voices and reject all of this.
I want to extend an enormous gratitude to each of you, and to you in particular, Jody.
I just wanted to make an offer,
please.
actually. So a number of you have asked, what can you do in that frustration? And I want to make an offer, and I know that when I go back to the office, everyone's going to shout at me. So I think there's only one CPJ person here, so if it gets said back, I didn't say it. But I know there's a lot of students here, and you really, really want to help. We are desperately, I think all of us, in need of support to properly investigate many of those cases. So if you are interested and have capacity, I would love to have a conversation about how you can support us, because we are doing that work, but we are desperately struggling because the capacity is very limited. And so I would love to have a conversation with anyone who is interested in helping support that investigative work, because I do think it's the foundation for us to be able to finally hold everybody to account.
I have great students, current and many former, with great OSINT skills and great language skills, who I know would love to be involved. So thank you so much for doing this, for doing the work that CPJ has done. Truly, I think it speaks volumes to even just be able to cite this amidst the dehumanization of so many others who are trying to raise awareness to this. Each of you, like Layla, Trevor, Sharif, Ken, all of you, thank you so much. It's been a real honor, and I'm grateful to the Lee Center. I know we've done a lot on Gaza over the last 2 years, but every chance I can get, I am happy to make that work, and thank you all so much.